Hello everyone, this is Dr. K, and welcome to the module on Agile Development. This is where things get kind of interesting. This material is based on chapters 5 and 6 of Software Engineering, a Practitioner's Approach, the 8th edition, by Roger Pressman and Bruce Maxim. In this video, we're going to talk about the Agile Manifesto. We're going to talk about what it is and how it came about. First, let's look at some common fears for software developers. These fears may look similar to the risks that we talked about in the last module when we talked about the spiral model. We might produce the wrong product. We might not produce a quality product. We might not deliver the product on time. We'll have to work long hours. We'll have to compromise. And we won't be having any fun. We're talking about the concerns of developers here because these concerns motivated the ideas behind Agile development. Agile development has an interesting history. In the 1990s, there were a lot of software developers and software development researchers who were critical of traditional software development practice. They saw traditional software development as something that was plagued by rigid software process, hard to maintain documentation, and engulfed in requirements churn. Some of these critics had developed alternative software processes like extreme programming and crystal clear. Back then, these were known as lightweight methods. As critics often do, they all had their own idea of what the best alternative was. So in 2001, about 20 of them met at the Snowbird Resort in Utah, and they tried to see if there was anything they could agree upon. Remarkably, there was. The result of that meeting was the Agile Manifesto, and it really had a significant impact on the software development community. Here's what the Agile Manifesto says. The first thing I want you to notice in that speech bubble at the top left is that they want to emphasize that they are software developers. They're not just business people. They're not just researchers. They are builders of software. They're out there getting their hands dirty. They've seen the problems, they've seen the mistakes, and they have a good idea of what needs to be done to correct them. The manifesto itself is a statement of emphasis. What should be valued in software development? As I go through each of these bullet points, I'll be quoting a lot from Robert Martin, who was one of the people at Snowbird. He developed the principles of agility, and he wrote an excellent article on the manifesto and the principles. It became chapter 1 of a book called Agile Principles, Patterns, and Practices in C#. And it's going to be one of your reading assignments for this week. Okay, let's get back to the manifesto. The first item here talks about individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Now, you don't have to pause the video for this, but if I give you 5 seconds, can you come up with one example of a process and one example of a tool in the sense that they're referring to here? 5 seconds starting now. Okay, this is not a trick question. A process could be a process model like the waterfall or the spiral, and a tool is a development tool like Eclipse or Rational Rows. There may be nifty processes and tools out there, and we're always interested in the newest thing. But the most important resources are talented individuals. Having said that, don't forget about interactions. how developers and others interact on a team may be more important than having programming talent. Here's what Martin says. A strong player is not necessarily an ace programmer. A strong player may be an average programmer, but someone who works well with others. Working well with others, communicating and interacting, is more important than raw programming talent. This notion of communication skills is going to crop up again and again in Agile development. As we will see, it's not just about the interaction between developers, but the interaction between developers and their customers is also absolutely critical. The second item is probably a very welcome one for any developer. There's a real fear among developers that they'll get bogged down in creating documentation and that will take them away from coding time. Martin says that there's a balance here. Too little documentation is bad, and too much documentation is bad also. But Martin says this, too much documentation is worse than too little. And that comment, I think, deserves a bit of thought. Part of the problem with too much documentation is that it takes time to produce. Okay, but there's a more serious problem with a lot of documentation. So please, pause the video and try to figure out why someone would say that too much documentation is worse than too little. Okay, this is interesting. We know that documentation takes time to produce, but perhaps more importantly, it also takes time to maintain and to keep in sync with the code. Why is that a more serious problem? Because if you don't keep the documentation in sync with the code, it's worse really than having no documentation. Because now you essentially have documentation that's lying to you. You read it, and it says the code is doing one thing, but the code is doing something else. The code was updated, and the documentation was not. That is a very serious problem. So, Martin has a law about documentation, and it's this. Produce no document unless its need is immediate and significant. Okay, let's talk about the third item. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. When you're negotiating something, it implies an adversarial relationship. When you're collaborating, everyone is part of the same team. And that's the attitude you should have, that the customers and the developers are on the same team. This close developer-customer interaction is a critical part of Agile methodology. It's a key factor in mitigating requirements churn. If developers and customers work together continuously, it's much easier to accommodate change. That brings us to the final item, responding to change over following a plan. The ability to respond to change is what agility has come to mean in the context of software engineering. Remember that one of the themes that Pressman rightly emphasizes over and over again is that of change. The fact that software will change, software must change, and software thrives on change. There's nothing wrong with having a plan, but make sure that plan is flexible enough to respond to change. And as Martin says, make detailed plans for the next week, rough plans for the next 3 months, and extremely crude plans beyond that. Here's Pressman's summary of what agility means in the context of software engineering. Item 1, echoes the fourth value, responding to change. Items 2 and 3 echo the third value, customer collaboration. And item 4 echoes the first value, individuals and interactions. And the yield here echoes the second value, working software. We'll see these notions again when we take an in-depth look at the principles of agility. It's conventional wisdom that change is relatively easy to deal with early in the development process because it's so close to where the requirements are collected. But it becomes much more difficult in the later stages of software development. This notion that change is easy to deal with at first and becomes harder is represented by the blue curve. Advocates of agile methods argue that the cost of change for agile development processes looks more like a line, and that's represented here by the dotted line. Now, it's debatable to what extent this is true, but most developers feel that the truth is somewhere in between. Here, that's represented by the red curve. This is Pressman's description of an agile process, and I don't think many agile advocates would disagree with this. However, they may feel that it's a bit incomplete. In the next slide, we'll spend some time talking about the agile principles as outlined by Martin, which give a more detailed look at what agility and agile processes are all about. These are all of the principles of agility. I've abbreviated them a bit so that they all fit on one page, but we'll see the entire principle when we go through them. Let's move these over to the left and give Martin a chance to comment on them. Okay, this is the first and arguably the most important principle. The highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery. Martin cites a study in the MIT Sloan Management Review that corroborates the effectiveness of this principle, namely that the quality of a software product is strongly correlated to early and frequent delivery. And remember, this is delivery to the customer, which is not the same thing as a public release of the software. If you wait too long before you show the customer working software, the overall quality is going to suffer. And that should make sense because the more the customer sees what the software is doing, the more they can give you meaningful feedback. Welcome changing requirements even late in development. Okay, a bit of honesty here. I don't know any developer who likes changing requirements late in development. That means you might have to throw away a lot of hard work that you've done. However, as Martin says, this is a statement of attitude. If you think of an agile process as getting closer and closer to the true software product with each successive iteration, then you can think of a requirements change as something that gets you closer to your ultimate goal. And that is a good thing. Deliver working software frequently. This principle tells us a couple things. First, it gets specific about how frequently you should deliver code to the customer, preferably every few weeks. Second, that word working is critical. It's implied in Principle 1 when we say valuable software. And it's used here in Principle 3, and it's used again in Principle 7. Just like Martin is saying here that documentation does not count as a true delivery, software that does not work does not count as a true delivery either. Business people and developers work together daily. We want software development to be a true collaboration between customers and developers. It's the customers who have the requirements, and it's the developers who have the ability to implement those requirements. Given the fact that requirements will change, we need continuous communication between those two groups of people. Build projects around motivated individuals. As Martin says, people are the most important success factor in an Agile project. We value individuals and interactions over processes and tools. In an Agile project, people talk to each other. Communication among developers and communication between developers and customers is critical to the success of a project. And despite the global nature of the software industry today, the most effective form of communication is still face-to-face communication. Here we go with the emphasis on working software again. And it really can't be emphasized enough. Here's Martin. Agile projects measure their progress by measuring the amount of software that's currently meeting the customer's need. They're 30% done when 30% of the necessary functionality is working. And that says it all. Principle 8, sustainable development. How many of us are guilty of waiting for the week before the deadline to get things done? I know I am, but that's not what Agile development is about. Agile development is a marathon. It's not a 100-yard dash. You have to pace yourself. And that pace should be something you can sustain indefinitely. This one is interesting because it emphasizes good design. Sometimes Agile methods are criticized because people say they jump into coding without spending enough time on design. Martin wants to counter that notion here by acknowledging that good design is absolutely essential. As we shall see, design is handled slightly differently in Agile methodologies than it is in traditional ones, but both groups acknowledge its importance. In the Agile world, keeping things simple means not anticipating tomorrow's problems and not trying to solve tomorrow's problems today. This is part of the sustainable development mentality. Do the work that you need to do today and leave tomorrow's work for tomorrow. Principle 11 emphasizes Agile development's focus on teams and collaboration as opposed to the hierarchical structures of traditional software development. Finally, a team has to understand that just like software needs to evolve and adapt to changing environments, the team itself may have to evolve and adapt. And it's important to periodically reflect on the effectiveness of the team and make adjustments based on that. Let's finish up with this slide that talks about the human factors involved in Agile development. In particular, it lists some key traits that an Agile team should have. This slide is from Pressman. It's not from Martin or an Agile advocate, but the traits listed here look reasonable. This material is actually related to Chapter 6 of Pressman, Human Aspects of Software Engineering. I'm not going to go over that chapter in my slides, but it is an interesting chapter, and it's not that long either, so I encourage you to read it. Okay, that's it for the Agile Manifesto. In the next video, we're going to talk about one of the most popular Agile processes, extreme programming. I'll see you there.